Hi, my name is Hannah Dusharm. This video is for Soch 151. Today I'm going to be talking about two different articles. So the first one being Shiro's article on understanding genocide, and the second one going to be Snyder's article on the Bloodlands. So first, starting with Shiro's article, which is just kind of basically getting at like key definitions and how to understand genocide and why it's possible. So the first issue that he talked about was really how to even define genocide, because if you look at it as something that only exists on the scale as the Holocaust or Rwanda, then it makes genocide sound something that's really rare and something that's really hard to understand or even wrap your mind around. So basically, he goes on to define genocide as politically motivated mass murder, which can range from like first-degree intentional murder to reckless manslaughter kind of thing. And then says that there are different ranges of genocide. So one being like ethnic cleansing, which an example would be the Holocaust. Another being nationalism, like in Stalin's Soviet Union, reasons of religion, or even just because a group of people occupies land that someone needs, basically. Those are all different reasons for genocide. But he goes into talking about four different varieties. So one being convenience, which an example would be like in westward expansion in America. Basically, the land was coveted, but there were natives living on the land, and they were killed because they were there at the time, and it was just convenience, basically. Another thing being fear, where people can think that killing for revenge is really like justice, and so in their minds it can kind of seem like a rational explanation for killing. Another thing being fear, which I think the best example would be Stalin and his idea of socialism, and he was afraid that peasants and farmers who didn't want to give up their produce or share their land, he was afraid that they would ruin basically his idea of Stalinism, or his idea of socialism, which would in turn ruin his grand overall plan. And so because of this, he killed them or deported them to camps or starved them. And lastly, the last variety I guess talked about is purification, or a fear of pollution, basically, which I think the most common example would be the Holocaust. So Hitler viewing people who were Jewish or homosexual or had any mental or physical disability, viewing them as weak and as racially polluting his like pure utopian of healthy Aryan people, basically. And so that was his motivation for killing, because these people were viewed as ill, basically, and he was against racial mixing and weakness, basically, so that was his rationale. But something interesting that this article notes is that, for example, the Holocaust, it wouldn't have been possible whatsoever without this one idea of viewing Jewish people or any of the people who were killed, viewing them as like inferior or as weak, or basically as not even human people. That this one idea of viewing them as pollution, I guess is the better word, was the basis for the Holocaust, and that without this even thought, the Holocaust wouldn't have been possible whatsoever. So moving on into the Bloodlands, this basically talks about the time between 1933 and 1945, and this area where the most mass killing went on between basically Hitler and Stalin. So just some quick background information. It starts basically with a political famine that Stalin directed at Soviet Ukraine, which killed more than 3 million lives. Then it moves into Stalin's Great Terror, in which 700,000 people were shot. Then it moves into the Soviets and the Germans co-occupying Poland, killing more than 200,000 people. Then it moves into the Germans starving Soviet prisoners of war, killing more than 4 million people. And then it talks about in the occupied Soviet Union, occupied Poland, and occupied surrounding Baltic states, the Germans shot and gassed over 5.4 million Jewish people. So this is basically examples of these mass killings going on in this one strip of area called the Bloodlands, or as referred to the Bloodlands throughout the article. So something important that I think kind of grasps like the theme of this article is they talk about two main ideas. First being that to understand this, you have to kind of also understand like and embrace the humanity behind these acts, or the lack of humanity, including the victims, but also on the side of the bystanders, the leaders, and the perpetrators, so the people doing the killing. But then also when you're comparing Stalin and Hitler, you have to kind of view it from an angle of life rather than death, and remember that these were real people and not looking at them as just numbers on a page, and trying to understand how did so many lives be brought to such a violent end. And I think that's important for this article because it talks a lot about humanity, basically, and trying to remember that these were real people who were killed. So basically, the article goes into talk about comparing Stalin and Hitler. So first saying that they were both politically motivated. Stalin, on one hand, was a project of self-colonization, so building the Soviet Union into a huge industrial power within its borders and its boundaries, basically. So not necessarily expanding, but building the Soviet Union up into a powerful industry. Whereas Hitler, on the other hand, was more about expansion. So he started really terrorizing people abroad who he viewed as threats to the German power. Also exploiting people, basically. In the long run, he was really trying to have a total conquest of the new Eastern Empire. And basically this started, to accomplish this, he had to kill millions of people to achieve his plan, or in his rationale, this was how he had to. So the two are both politically motivated, but different reasonings on both sides. Something that was interesting that this article talks about is that so the Germans were usually killing people who were not Germans because the whole idea was to build the German race, whereas the Soviets ended up killing a lot of people who were Soviets, basically as anyone who was seen as like internal threats to the growth of the Soviet Union. So now looking at the similarities and the differences between the two articles, I think there are a lot more similarities in the sense that terms used in Chiro's article can be applied to what's talked about in the Bloodlands, and basically the Bloodland is examples of what Chiro is talking about. So the first one, what I would say would be Chiro's idea of cleansing, how he said that the only reason the Holocaust was possible was because there was this one thought of viewing basically these people as needing cleansing, as being the weak, as being inferior, basically. And this relates to the Bloodlands because they talk about how the key to both National Socialism and Stalinism and Hitler's policies was their ability, and not just Hitler and Stalin, but all the people who worked for them, their ability to deprive groups of human beings their right as being viewed as a human. So they were stripped down to basically numbers, killed in large groups of people, mass murders. They didn't have their identity anymore. They were just viewed as things, not even people, just things who could be killed, basically. So this relates to Chiro's idea of cleansing. Another thing they talk about was fear in Chiro's article. I had talked about how Stalinism was in fear that certain people would ruin his idea of socialism. This idea of fear also relates to Hitler, I think, because and Stalin, both groups kind of use people as scapegoats. So there were people who they could blame if their realization was impossible, or if something went terribly wrong, they could blame these people, basically. So the Jewish people, everyone who was killed, people with mental, physical illnesses, they were looked as the problem for everything. And if anything ever went seriously wrong, they would still be viewed as the problem, even though they were the ones who were being killed. So that aspect of the Bloodlands article relates to Chiro's idea of fear. Another interesting thing, going back to like the arcing definition of it being politically motivated, both, as I mentioned, talk about how they were politically motivated, both just in different aspects. So what I'm trying to say is that what's talked about in the Bloodlands, they both fit Chiro's big definition of what genocide is. As I said, though, they did have different but political plans, basically. So I would say Stalin had more of a political plan, where the article talks about how he used Marxism and turned that into like an everyday workday force, and really trying to like grow the Soviet citizens and make everything logical and an upward movement towards, as I said, this big industrial power, where Hitler was more, his colonization was more directed at starving and deporting tens of millions of people. Anyone who he viewed as inferior, as I said. But both politically motivated aspects do include that, like, the economic planners of each person assume that more people existed than were really necessary. So both basically planned on removing people who were unnecessary and sending them to work camps or to the gulag to work, or killing them. So that's some aspect that the two have similar. Another thing mentioned in Shiro was an idea of convenience, which also can be applied to this because in both situations, as mentioned in the Bloodlands, there was social advancement once so many people were killed, because now jobs that Jewish people had, houses that Jewish people were living in, these were all basically available now since these people had been killed. So German people can now take over these jobs, take over these areas, and it allowed for social advancement for a lot of people. Something that I found different between the two articles, which I had kind of talked about earlier, was that the Bloodlands kind of talks a lot about the humanity aspect, whereas Shiro's is really just like definitions, like this is why people kill other people. And something interesting that the Bloodlands emphasizes is that all these ideologies, all these economic and political connections, it kind of becomes a way of like moralizing and explaining this killing, basically. And it says, in quote, it comfortably separates the people who explain from the people who kill, basically. I thought this was just really interesting, which relates back to what I mentioned earlier about how the Bloodlands had a huge focus on like humanity, whereas Shiro's article was more just like cold, just like facts, basically. And that was a huge thing that I saw in the difference between the articles. And then just one like confusion or question that I had basically was that, so Shiro had like the 4 main ideas or varieties of genocide, but in the Bloodlands it talks a lot about economic motivations and then economic plans, basically, and economic perspectives of each group. And I was just confused if economic falls under or is like the same thing as a political motivation, or if economic motivation would fall underneath political motivation but in with one of the 4, or maybe be like a 5th category of genocide, because like I said, it talks a lot about and this is a quote, the transformations envisioned by both Hitler and Stalin were economic, and the consequences of their economic policies were felt most painfully in the Bloodlands. So I'm just confused where economic policies falls on this spectrum. But other than that, I think there are a lot of similarities and some differences between the two. Thanks.